talking about the mutual challenges facing the United States and Mexico. Joining us from New York is Omar Garcia-Ponce. He specializes in comparative politics and the political economy of organized crime. With us here in Washington is the Vice President of the Council of the Americas and America's Society, Eric Farnsworth. And from Mexico City, we're joined by Vidal Romero. He's a political science professor in Mexico. Gentlemen, thanks to all of you for joining us. Vidal Romero, let me start with you. What were the priorities for these two leaders when they met, and did they achieve what they set out to do?
Yeah, I think it was a very useful meeting, especially for Mexico, in terms of reassuring the U.S. that Mexico can receive all new investments and that public insecurity is not going to get into the way of investing in energy, especially oil and that kind of resources.
So, Eric, when we talk about the relationship between these two countries, I mean, the three topics that often come up: trade, immigration, security, or crime, organized crime. Are these two leaders on the same page when it comes to all of those issues?
Well, they seem to be. Certainly the U.S. relationship with Mexico is defined by geography, history, culture. It is deep, it's broad, it's multifaceted, but you're right, those are the three issues that tend to be on the forefront. You could probably add one in the current environment, and that's energy as well. And I think both leaders talked about all four of those topics. Immigration is primarily an issue in terms of U.S. domestic politics that impacts Mexico, whereas security is primarily an issue of domestic politics in Mexico that impacts the United States. So there's an issue there in terms of how much one can do to support the other, and I'm sure they talked about that. But trade is, by definition, mutually, it's a topic for mutual discussion. And energy, given the very exciting reforms that Mexico has engaged in or has passed over the last year, that's a real area of opportunity, and as your previous guest just said, something that they clearly talked about as well.
Okay, Omar, when we look at the headlines coming out of Mexico, it seems that every day there's a headline about the drug-related violence in that country. What did these two leaders discuss insofar as them jointly trying to tackle this problem?
Well, it seems that President Obama was pressing Peña Nieto to put more effort in controlling the problem of drug-related violence in Mexico, also in securing the border. However, it seems that Peña Nieto is struggling a lot in something that at which he used to excel, which is receiving and effectively manipulating media attention for political ends. We are seeing a president that, because of corruption scandals and the security problems in the country, in particular the disappearance of the 40 street students in Ayotzinapa, is facing the lowest rate of presidential approval in 20 years. So he left the country with a huge amount of protests, and he's coming back to Mexico and receiving the country in the same way. So I think this is probably the priority now for the Mexican government. However, I don't see much of a strategy right now to tackle the problem.
Vidal Romero, one of the criticisms that Enrique Peña Nieto has faced in Mexico, as well as in the United States to some extent, is that he does not pay enough attention to the problem of violence in the country. And we've heard some say that he likes to sweep this under the carpet. Is that a valid criticism?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that he was really quite focused on economic reforms in Mexico, and the violence problem, he tried to cover up somehow that things were improving in Mexico, but it was not, unfortunately, it was not only a media downplaying the issue, but it was actually the government not doing enough work on public security. And that's what we're seeing now, that things are just exploding everywhere in the country. I think the current government mismanaged the issue for the first 2 years of his administration.
Eric, the online newspaper, The Daily Beast, actually posed a very interesting question. They said that the president of Mexico came to the United States. He is the president of Mexico, but which Mexico did he represent in the United States? The Mexico of money or the Mexico of misery?
Well, I think that might be a little bit dramatic, a little bit Manichaean, either or. He's probably better seen as the president of Mexico, which has some challenges, but also some opportunities. I think we have to remember he was only elected 2 years ago, and he was elected in part because the previous president, President Calderon, had been criticized for emphasizing security too much. And so President Peña Nieto came into office with a mandate to really change the narrative, change the dialogue, focus more on economic development, not to disregard the security challenges, but frankly not to prioritize those in the same way. So some of this, one could say he was reacting to or responding to the Mexican voters. At the same time, you can't just completely walk away from the security agenda, even as you're trying to promote an economic agenda. I think you have to do both, and I think that's what's really been coming to the fore over the last year in Mexico in 2014. And his visit here to Washington this week has been an opportunity, perhaps, to relaunch that agenda to say, look, we are partners with the United States. We have a broad agenda. Let's address these challenges together.
All right, Omar, while the president was here, there have been some fierce demonstrations right here in Washington over the president's visit, people demonstrating, saying that he is incompetent, that he is corrupt, his administration is corrupt. Do you think any of that resonated in the talks between these two leaders?
Well, I don't think that was in the debate that Obama and Peña Nieto had yesterday. However, I would like to come back to this question on who represents or who Peña Nieto represents, because it's very, very, very important to highlight that he has only 2 years in office, but only after 2 years he's experiencing presidential approval rates that are typically representative of a president who is at the end of his administration. And that's something very, very important, because we are seeing that the majority of the electorate doesn't support Peña Nieto's strategies towards a number of issues, not only public security strategies, but also some of the reforms that he was able to enact and are going to be implemented. So I think this is a very, very serious issue, because the success of these reforms will depend on the ability of the presidential administration to implement them and satisfy a large part of the electorate. So given the current rates of presidential approval, the dissatisfaction expressed by many Mexicans, it seems a huge challenge to implement these reforms successfully in the near future.
Vidal Romero, is the president facing anything of a political struggle inside Mexico? I mean, we've seen him being criticized for instance, his wife's been involved in a real estate scandal. He's been accused of bungling his response to the disappearance and subsequent murder of 43 students in the town of Iguala, which is very near Mexico City. Is he having a problem there?
Yes, they're having a problem, and it's not only with human rights organizations and the like, but it comes at a very bad time for the government. Both the corruption and the Ayotzinapa issue, the 43 students, comes probably at the worst time for the government, because right now, after the reforms were enacted, they are looking for investors, and investors are outside Mexico, and it's kind of hard to get investors to be interested in Mexico when they are hearing all these corruption and insecurity stories. So the government, I mean, perhaps for the wrong reasons, but they now really care, and public opinion really care about the issue, both because of the human rights issue, but also because of economic consequences of these two maladies of the Mexican system. Because, I mean, it's been a corrupt system, and insecurity has been here for years and years, but now it's linked to foreign investment, so it becomes quite relevant in all dimensions.
Eric, what about the American view of Mexico? I mean, I was looking at one report from the Woodrow Wilson Institute written by David Shirk, and he says President Obama has not been able to give Mexico what they call the bandwidth it deserves.
Well, that's a perennial lament, I think, for those of us who watch and care about Latin America and the Western Hemisphere U.S. policy toward the region. Yes, the president has been focused on things like Afghanistan and Iraq, certainly issues in Asia and economics, et cetera. So that is a common criticism. But I think the idea that the president or the administration have not paid attention to Mexico, I think, is wrong. I think if you look at the relationship between the United States and Mexico, it is so well integrated that oftentimes you don't actually need to have the presidents engaged at, on a daily basis, because the bureaucracies are already working together across a huge range of issues. Of course, you need the chief executives to give guidance, to give political support, of course. But at the same time, this is a relationship that is very well developed. It's not a relationship, for example, that might be with a country that's in another part of the world. One other point I wanted to make, I think the issue in terms of the president's approval ratings is a very important point. They are below, the Mexican presidents, they are below 40%. After only 2 years, that is somewhat of a surprise. And I think that's partially a result of the president of Mexico being a bit in a vice. The political costs of reform have been paid, but the benefits have not yet been received, because implementation of energy reform, implementation of education reform, implementation of telecommunications reform, labor reform has not been fully utilized or recognized. And so, therefore, the benefits have not yet accrued. Well, because they take time to implement. You have to write the regulations, and then people have to implement the regulations, then investment has to come in, then you have to, it just takes time. And so those benefits don't develop until the midterm. At the same time, the people who have lost advantages or who have been negatively impacted, those costs accrue immediately. So you begin to have that political difficulty. At the same time, some very disturbing issues on the security front have arisen over the past several months. And so you have the impression then that the security situation is deteriorating rapidly. And if you put the two together, you have a scenario whereby the president has not yet received the political benefit of doing the political reforms. When he spoke to the nation on the 1st of January to say, this is my agenda for 2015, you heard him talk about lower electricity costs, better education, all the things that presumably would accrue from the reforms. But that's just going to take time to work itself through the system.
Vidal Romero, one other development that I have to talk about, and that is the U.S. effort to restore or normalize the relationship with Cuba. Both leaders have welcomed this. So how does Mexico help the United States in strengthening this relationship?
Well, Mexico has had a very good relationship with Cuba historically, perhaps with the interlaps with President Fox. And so Mexico can be very useful for the U.S. in terms of talking directly with Cuban leaders and arranging all sorts of agreements. And, well, curiously enough, there are some fronts in which the U.S. Improving relationship with Cuba is not going to help Mexico. For instance, think of tourism. Cuba is going to become now a direct competitor of Mexico in tourism, and there are some other, perhaps manufacturing eventually. So Mexico is ambiguous because it's much more an ideologically friendship with Cuba than an economic profitable relationship that Mexico has with Cuba. So things may change once the U.S. Start actually improving. It will take time, but I don't think that Mexico is gonna stay as the best friend of Cuba and helping the U.S. to improve relationships. So it's a difficult thing.
Vidal Romero, Eric Farnsworth, Omar Garcia-Ponce, thanks to all of you for joining us. And that's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at @CCTV_America. I'm Anand Naidoo in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.